Hey everybody, Paul here once again. Back in 2018, I did a tutorial on making a character turnaround sheet using the then new grease pencil tool inside of Blender. It's still a very popular video on my channel, but I think it's probably time that we had a revisit. It's a year and a half since there have been a lot of improvements to workflow as well as under the hood in general in the grease pencil. So in the following video, I'm going to reintroduce you to the grease pencil and take you through some steps to help you manage your assets in a simple and effective way to draw and create a character turnaround sheet. Hope you're ready. Why don't we get started? So what we'll be creating today is this character turnaround sheet. Now this is the character Carl from my home-based webcomic, and I've created a very simple asset with a few layers here, and the materials that I've used are in my materials tab for my grease pencil. We're looking through the camera right now, and a camera is essential for rendering out an image. And because grease pencil is an object, it doesn't depend on a resolution. Think of it more like a vector graphic, that the more you zoom in, it's still a very crisp, clear line. That's because these are, sort of like points on a curve when they get created. The closest analog that's probably out there is something like Adobe Illustrator or Inkscape, where you're drawing with vector art. But of course, you have the advantage of drawing in 3D space, so you can see that this exists on a plane. And this also has its advantages for 3D workflow. And so what I'm going to take you through today is how to set up your grease pencil object very quickly, and then a nice little time lapse of the drawing process that I like to go through in creating this file. So when you open up Blender for the first time, you get this splash screen and you get the nice default cube. This is an optional thing, but you can maybe make yourself a layout just for drawing. However, if you delete or add any objects, they will appear across all of your tabs. So you can just hit this little plus button, change your layout, and then go ahead. But it's not entirely necessary because the modifications that we're making are very, very simple. Now I'm going to leave this camera here, but I'm going to remove this lamp. It's not necessary for our purposes. The first things you want to do when setting up a file is you want to go down to your scene properties and set your units. Now I'm in Australia, so I use the metric system, and my unit scale is going to be set to 1, but I'm going to change my length from meters to centimeters. So if I go down to my, if I hit T, if your left-hand toolbox isn't showing, and you go down to your measurement tool, you can click and drag a length to see how many centimeters these units are basically representing. So for 2 meters, each of these squares here represent about, what would that be, 10 centimeters, I guess? Yes, 10 centimeters, so that 20 of these would be about 2 meters. And this is probably a good idea because what we want to do is create a grid on which to draw our character and have the grid represent a real world value. Now the other thing I like to do is go into my world property settings, and if I'm in viewport shading material preview, I can click on this little arrow here and click on scene world. And in my world settings, if I just click on that color swatch and brighten that up, now it's almost like I can be working on a nice white piece of paper, or I generally like to warm up my background a little bit, so I have a little bit off-white in the warm tones, but that's completely up to you. Whatever you can create to make the drawing of your strokes more visible to you, that's basically the idea here. And so that's all I do to set up my Blender settings in order to draw. Okay, so why don't we go ahead and create a grease pencil object. We just simply go Shift A, grease pencil, and I'm going to select blank. I'm going to go over into draw mode here so that I can set up my grease pencil to work to maximum efficiency. Now the first thing that I like to do is go over here to my view tab and enable my tool settings. This gives me a nice tool shelf up here from which I can access my draw tools. I can change the radius of my pencil, and you can see a few other options here to further customize your brush. The other thing I like to do is to set my view to front, because I will be drawing in the XZ plane, and that basically means in front view. Now, a lot of people like to draw in top view. That's basically drawing top down. Just quickly switch my drawing plane to view here and do a quick sketch. You can see that that draws in the XY axis, and then if I was to go into my front view and draw a quick sketch, you can see how that draws in the XZ axis, right? And so that's what the having it on the view property does. You can go into any sort of orthographic view, or if I'm here in perspective and I decide to sketch, that basically floats in the view that I decided to have my camera set at that time. And that's why it can get a little bit tricky. So what I'm going to do is just going to erase those strokes for a second, go back into only draw into front XZ, which means it locks it off. So if I'm in perspective view and I begin to draw, it only draws in that particular axis. And so you've got no issue with drawing in some axis that you didn't mean to draw in. Our next protocol is to go over to our grease pencil properties tab. Now, because I started drawing, it's automatically created a grease pencil layer. Our first grease pencil layer will probably be some blue lines. So I'm going to double click on where it says GP layer, and I'm going to call this blue line. So the next thing we want to look at is materials, and this is where we begin to create a number of materials which we will use to assign to our pencils or pens or inks. What we have to do is go new, and I'm going to call this one blue line. I'm going to go down here to stroke, and under color, I'm going to change that color to something like a blue, and then I'm going to add a couple more. So you have to add a material to this particular window over here, and not just add materials here, because this material will basically be where you select them from, but this will basically be a drop down of all the materials available for this grease pencil object. So I'm going to add another material. I might as well just modify blue line by selecting blue line there and then hitting this numeral 2. You'll see a little 001 appear. I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to call this black, or inks black. And I'm going to change that color back to black. And I'm just going to create a third one for our grid layer based on our blue line. Click on that 2 again and call this gray line. And let's just set this one to maybe like a mid-tone gray. Okay. Now, of course, aside from just strokes, you can also create fills, and they are very, very useful. So we're going to create another material, and I'm going to base this on my inks black material. I'm going to hit that numeral 2, and I'm going to relabel it and call it fill black. And I'm going to change my surface from stroke to fill. What this essentially does is, if I was to select that fills black material, is as I draw a shape, it is filled in as the fill name suggests. And of course, anyone coming from Inkscape or Illustrator knows just how a stroke and a fill work. And these materials can be very useful as well. So aside from just our materials, we have a couple of other options, such as the brush set. The default one is just fine for our purposes. What I tend to like to do is to draw my inks with the Draw Ink brush, but the Draw Pencil, I like to assign the blue line to it with this pin, so that if I'm, say, in Draw Ink, and I'm in Inks Black, and then I switch over to Fills Black, and then I go over to my pencil will automatically have that material assigned to it. Okay, and so if I have to do any more blue line work, I can just go into my pencil and I know that that material is assigned. Now, aside from just the brushes and obviously the erase and this fill tool, you also have a number of primitives which can sometimes come in handy. So I'm going to select that gray line material here to demonstrate this. So obviously we're going to have to make a grid. So if I click and I drag, I can draw a line. And if I hold down Shift, I can lock that line to a horizontal, a diagonal, or a vertical line. And so this comes in very handy, especially if we want to make some sort of grid to draw our character on. You can further edit these lines because, let's just go into solid mode over here so that we can get a darker background and we can see this. In edit mode, you can see that these points are like vertices on a mesh, and you can even do things like proportional fall off on a stroke. Also, if you have a fairly complex line drawn and you go into edit mode, you'll notice that this line has got a lot of vertices to it. You can do something like a cleanup and do a merge by distance, let's say 0.4, and you can see how that line now simplifies. You can also do things like smooth, and you can add the amount it repeats, or change the factor of that smoothness for that line. But let's not cover everything because we want to get on to the actual drawing. So now that we've covered the basics, it's time to get to drawing. So what I'm going to do is I'm over in my object data properties for the grease pencil line. I'm going to add another layer. I'm going to call this grid, and I'm going to move it to my bottom layer. This will be the first one that I draw on. So let's just lock off the blue line layer so that we don't draw on this and just draw on this grid. Okay, in our measurement tool, we know that we've got roughly 2 meters about here. And if we go into our solid, we can sort of see what squares make up what height. And so this will help us in drawing. We see that this square over here is 1 meter and this is 1 meter. We'll go over into draw mode, and using our draw ink set to gray line, I'm going to enable the line primitive, click, and holding down Shift, I'm going to drag to draw a line roughly at the 0 mark, again at the 1 meter, again at the 2 meter, and then in between at the sort of 0.5 meter mark. I did it rough because I know that I can then go into edit mode and select all of those dots, and using Shift S, just like you would with vertices or a curve, I can snap these to grid. And now once they're snapped to the grid, you know that they are going to exist at these precise locations: 0, 50 centimeters, 1 meter, 1.5 and 2 meters. Okay, I'm just going to go into my material preview over here, go back into draw mode, and with my draw ink set to pencil over here, I can go 0 meters, 0.5, 1 meter, 1.5, 2 meters, nice and roughly. Okay, and that's my grid. What I want to then do is lock that off and drop the opacity. And now unlock my blue line. That's where I'm going to be drawing my character. Now you'll notice that we've got our cursor still set at the center over here. I'm going to go over to my draw pencil on which I have my blue line material set. And I'm going to add a modifier before I draw, and the modifier is mirror. Now you'll notice as soon as you add it, all of the line work mirrors. So you've got the gray line and all that. And what we want to do is just have the layer blue line mirrored. And so here under layer, I'm going to select blue line. The mirror on the gray grid disappears, and we know that if we now begin to draw, it will mirror it across the axis as defined by your cursor. Now why don't we go ahead and begin to draw on our blue line layer with our pencil set to blue line material, and I'm going to add pressure sensitivity here, and we might go into a little bit of a time lapse as we begin to sketch. So I'm just sketching the blue line here using the mirror modifier, and sometimes jumping into edit mode to do a little bit of scaling or sculpting. I'm just drawing out some lines here to measure the head height and give myself some markers to draw the side view on so that everything kind of lines up correctly on the character sheet. So that if there's someone who's going to be doing a 3D model, they can basically put this front and side and have something that's very close so that they can then build that model. To get the back view, I just duplicate the front view and then just erase some of the features and then sort of redraw some of the parts so that it looks like Carl from behind. This means that all the measurements are accurate and everything else just sort of lines up correctly. Now, this is optional, but I like to do a second pencil pass or a blue line pass just to refine the line work before I do my inks so that I have a better template to work in. Sometimes when drawing things like arms and torso, instead of going into mirror mode, I will just select those vertices, duplicate and scale across the x-axis. And I'll do that again here with the leg. One thing to keep in mind when you do this, sometimes the stroke also mirrors. So if you have a thick stroke, it'll suddenly go really, really thin. But all you have to do is select all those vertices and hit Alt S and then just scale up like you would with a curve. So now I make that a little bit less opaque and add an ink layer, and then using my ink brush, I go into using my black inks material and begin to further refine the inks. Occasionally I'll switch over to the fill black for the eyebrows. I've enabled the stabilize feature on this particular brush and I've set it to something around about 15. Now what the stabilize does is just make it very easier to get a nice even stroke, but you have to sort of watch it when you go around sharp corners. So it's sometimes you might have to do 2 strokes, or you might have to turn it off just to do that little cornering segment, or maybe just lower it. But it is certainly something that can help. You'll see that I often just go back into edit mode just to refine some of those vertices. Sometimes I just clean them up. Sometimes I just use a proportional fall off to just scale or further refine them. And I find these tools invaluable to the process because it just makes the work a lot easier. You can get nice, clean looking inks very, very quickly. Now, to do the color fills is very simple. I add a fill layer, put it under the line work layer, and then I make all the other layers invisible, just having the inks on. Then with my bucket fill tool on my fill layer, I simply select the color fill that I want to fill it with and click. Now, the inks provide the boundary, and grease pencil pretty much does the rest, and that's a very quick way of filling your colored areas. And there is our finished file. Of course, the final step is to enable a camera, and I happen to have one in the scene right about there, and looking through it, you can basically just place your camera where you want it. These text things are basically just text, which I wrote. I'm not going to get into that part. And render. Now, of course, I've got my resolution set to 1920 by 1080, which is essentially HD at 100%, but it will inherit your screen resolution. So most screens are about 72 dpi, some might be 150. I'm going to assume it's 72. So if you want this for some sort of a print resolution, you can always just bump up the percentage. So to go to something like 400%, which would be like 4 times this resolution, means you get something close to 300 dpi. And then of course you make sure that your output settings are set, and then you hit render image. Now, stills have a funny way of not rendering straight out when you hit that render button. Sometimes what you have to do is go image, save as, and that's where I'm just going to save as image PNG and give it a name. And once that's done, you should have a nice final image, and this is something that can go into a PDF or be emailed to a production pipeline, whoever's going to take that image next. And that's pretty much the end of the process. So I hope you got a lot out of that tutorial. Of course, as always, if you like what you see here, why not subscribe to my YouTube channel by hitting the subscribe button? And if you're feeling at all generous, you can join the ranks of my Patreon supporters over at patreon.com. It's the support I get over there at Patreon that makes the production of these videos possible. Thanks for watching, guys. Bye for now.